10. The noise grew louder, flooded in. A pale cloud enveloped the window. A glass rattled on the washstand. A train passed by, and now the empty expanse of the railway tracks could be seen again fanning out from the window. Berlin, gentle and misty, toward evening, in April. That Thursday at twilight, when the noise of the train sounded hollower than ever, Clara came to see Gannon in a high state of agitation to give him a message from Ludmilla. "Tell him," Ludmilla said, "tell him this, that I'm not one of those women that men can just drop. I'm the one who does the dropping. Tell him I don't want anything from him. I'm not making any demands, but I think it was filthy of him not to have answered my letter. I wanted to break it off with him in a friendly way, to suggest that even if we don't love each other anymore, we can simply be friends, but he couldn't even be bothered to ring me up. Tell him, Clara, that I wish him luck with his German girl, and that I know he won't be able to forget me as quickly as he may think." "Where on earth did she get the German girl from?" said Gannon, making a face, when Clara, without looking at him and talking in a low, rapid voice, had delivered her message. "Anyway, why does she have to involve you in this business? It's all very tiresome." "You know, Lev Glebovich," Clara burst out, dousing him with one of her moist looks, "you really are heartless. Ludmilla thinks nothing but good of you. She idealizes you, but if she knew all about you—" Gannon looked at her with amiable astonishment. Embarrassed, Clara dropped her glance. "I only gave you the message because she asked me to," Clara said quietly. "I must leave," Gannon said after a silence. "This room, these trains, Erica's cooking, I'm fed up with it all. Besides, I'm nearly out of money and I shall have to work again soon. I'm thinking of leaving Berlin for good on Saturday, going south to some seaport." He clenched and unclenched his fist and lapsed into pensiveness. "I don't know, though. There's one circumstance. You'd be amazed if you knew what has just occurred to me. An extraordinary, credible plan. If it comes off, I'll be out of this town by the day after tomorrow." Really, what a strange man he is, thought Clara, with that aching feeling of loneliness which always overcomes us when someone dear to us surrenders to a daydream in which we have no place. Gannon's glassy black pupils dilated. His thick eyelashes gave his eyes a warm, downy look, and a serene smile of contemplation lifted slightly his upper lip, bearing the white expanse of his glistening, even teeth. His dark eyebrows, which reminded Clara of scraps of expensive fur, alternately met and parted, and soft furrows came and went on his smooth forehead. Noticing Clara's stare, he blinked, passed his hand across his face, and remembered what he'd been intending to say to her. "Yes, I'm going, and that will end everything. Simply tell her that Gannon is leaving, and wants her not to think ill of him. That is all." 11. On Friday morning, the dancers sat round the following note to the other 4 lodgers. "Because, 1. Mr. Gannon is leaving us. 2. Mr. Potygin is preparing to leave. 3. Mr. Alferov's wife is arriving tomorrow. 4. Miss Clara is celebrating her 26th birthday. And 5. The Under Siege have obtained an engagement in this city. Because of all this, a celebration will be held tonight at 10 p.m. in room April 6. "How kind of them," said Potygin with a smile as he went out of the house with Gannon, who had agreed to accompany him to a police station. "Where are you going when you leave Berlin, Lyushka?" "Far away? Yes, you're a bird of passage. When I was young, I longed to travel, to swallow the whole wide world. Well, it's darn well happened." He hunched himself against the fresh spring wind and turned up the collar of his well-kept dark gray overcoat with its huge bone buttons. He still felt a debilitating weakness in the legs, an after effect of his heart attack, but today he derived a certain cheerful relief from the thought that he would most likely have done it all without the fuss, done with all the fuss about his passport, and that he might even get permission to leave for Paris the very next day. The vast purple-red building of the Central Police Headquarters faced onto 4 streets. It was built in a grim but extremely bad Gothic style, with dim windows and highly intriguing courtyard forbidden to the public. An impassive policeman stood at the main portal. An arrow on the wall pointed across the street to a photographer's studio, where in 20 minutes one could obtain a miserable likeness of oneself, half a dozen identical physiognomies, of which one was stuck onto the yellow page of the passport. Another one went into the police archives, while the rest were probably distributed among the officials' private collections. Potygin and Gannon entered a wide gray corridor. At the door of the passport department stood a little table where an ancient, bewhiskered official issued numbered tickets. occasionally casting a schoolmasterly glance over his spectacles at the small polyglot crowd of people. "You must stand in the queue and get a number," said Gannon. "And I never did that before," the old poet replied in a whisper. "I just used to go straight in through the door." When he received his ticket a few minutes later, he was delighted and looked even more like a fat guinea pig than ever. In the bare, stuffy, sunlit room where officials sat at their desks behind a low partition, there was another crowd which appeared to have come for the sole purpose of staring at those lugubrious scribes. Gannon pushed his way through, with Potyagan snuffling along trustfully after him. Half an hour later, having handed in Potyagan's passport, they moved over to another desk. Again a queue, a crush of people. Somebody had bad breath, and at last, for the price of a few marks, the yellow sheet of paper was returned, now adorned with a magic stamp. "Now off we go to the consulate," grunted Potyagan joyfully as they left the redoubtable-looking, though in reality rather dreary, building. "It's in the bag now. How do you manage to talk to them so calmly, my dear Lev Glebovich? It was such agony for me when I went before. Come, let's go to the top deck of the bus. What a joy this is. I'm actually in a sweat, you know." He was the first to clamber up the twisting staircase. The conductor on the top deck banged on the iron side with his hand, and the bus moved off. Horses, signboards, sunlight on the shop windows floated by. "Our grandchildren will never understand all this nonsense about visas," said Potyagan, reverently examining his passport. "They'll never understand that there could be so much human anxiety connected with a simple rubber stamp. Do you think," he added anxiously, "that the French really will give me a visa now?" "Of course they will," said Gannon. "After all, they told you that permission had been given." "I think I'll leave tomorrow," Potyagan smiled. "Let's go together, Lyovishka. It'll be fine in Paris. No, you just look what a mug I have here." Gannon glanced over his arm at the passport with its photograph in the corner. The photograph was quite remarkable. A dazed, bloated face with swam and a grayish murk. "I have no less than 2 passports," Gannon said with a smile. "One Russian, which is real but very old, and a Polish one, forged. That's the one I use." As he paid the conductor, Potyagan put down the yellow document on the seat beside him, selected 40 pfennigs from the several coins in his hand, and glanced up at the conductor. "Gemug?" Then he looked sideways at Gannon. "What did you say, Lev Glebovich? Forged?" "Certainly. My first name really is Lev, but my surname is not Gannon at all." "What do you mean, my dear fellow?" Potyagan goggled in amazement and suddenly clutched at his hat. A strong wind was blowing. "Well, that's the way it was," ruminated Gannon. "About 3 years ago. Partition detachment in Poland, and so on. Thought I'd break through to St. Petersburg and raise a rebellion. Now it's quite convenient and rather fun having this passport." Potyagan suddenly looked away and said glumly, "I dreamed about St. Petersburg last night, Lyovishka. I was walking along the Nevsky. I knew that it was the Nevsky, although it looked nothing like it. The houses had sloping angles, as in a futurist painting, and the sky was black, although I knew it was daytime, and the passers-by were giving me strange looks. Then a man crossed the street and took aim at my head. He's an old haunter of mine. It's terrible, oh terrible. That's whenever we dream about Russia, we never dream of it as beautiful, as we know it as in reality, but as something monstrous, the sort of dreams where the sky is falling in and you feel the world's coming to an end." "No," said Gannon, "I only dream about the beautiful things. The same woods, the same country house. Sometimes it's all rather deserted, with unfamiliar clearings. But that does not matter. We have to get out of here, Anton Sergeyevich." He went down the spiral staircase and helped Potyagan to step onto the pavement. "Just look at the way the water sparkles," Potyagan remarked, breathing laboriously, and pointed at the canal with 5 fingers stretched. "Careful, mind that bicycle," said Gannon. "There's the consulate over there on the right. Please accept my sincere thanks, Lev Glebovich. If I'd been on my own, I'd never have got through all that red tape. It's a great relief to me. Farewell, Deutschland." They entered the consulate building. As they went up to the stairs, Potyagan began searching in his pockets. "Come on," said Gannon, turning around, but the old man kept searching. 12. Only 4 of the lodgers had turned up for lunch. "I wonder why our friends are so late," said Alfierov cheerfully. "I suppose they've had no luck." He positively breathed joyful expectation. On the previous day he had been to the station and found at the exact time of arrival of the morning of the fast train for the north, 8:05. Today he had cleaned his suit, bought a pair of new cuffs, and a bunch of lily-of-the-valley. His financial affairs appeared to have put themselves right. Before lunch he had sat in a cafe with a gloomy, clean-shaven gentleman who had offered him what was undoubtedly a money-making proposition. His mind, used as it was to figures, was now preoccupied with one single figure, made up of a unit and a decimal fraction, 8.05. This was the percentage of happiness which fate had temporarily allotted to him, and tomorrow he screwed up his eyes, sighed, and imagined how early tomorrow morning He would go to the station, how he would wait on the platform, how the train would come rushing in. After lunch he disappeared, as he did the dancers who went out surreptitiously, as excited as two women, to buy little delicacies. Only Clara stayed home. Her head ached, and the thin bones of her fat legs were hurting, which was unfortunate, as today was her birthday. I'm 26 today, she thought, and tomorrow Gannon is leaving. He is bad, he deceives women, and he is capable of committing a crime. He can look me calmly in the eyes, even though he knows I saw him just about to steal money. Yet he's wonderful, and I think about him literally all day, and there's no hope whatsoever. She looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was paler than usual. Beneath a lock of chestnut hair, low down on her forehead, she had broken out in a faint rash, and there were shadows under her eyes. She could not stand the glossy black dress which she wore day in, day out. There was a very obvious darn in the seam of her dark, transparent stocking, and one of her heels was crooked. Potugin again returned about 5 o'clock. Clara heard their footsteps and looked out. Pale as death, his overcoat open, and holding his collar and tie in his hand, Potugin walked silently past it to his room and locked the door behind him. "What happened?" asked Clara in a whisper. Gannon clicked his tongue. "He's lost his passport, then he had an attack, right there in front of the house. I could hardly drag him upstairs. The lift's not working, unfortunately. We've been searching all over town." "I'll go and see him," said Clara. "He'll need comforting." Potugin would not let her in at first. When he finally did open the door, Clara groaned when she saw his muzzy, confused expression. "Have you heard?" he said with a wistful grin. "I am an old idiot. Everything was ready, you see, and then I have to go and—" "Where did you drop it, Anton Sergeyevich?" "That's it. I dropped it. Poetic license. Elided passport. The Trousered Cloud by Mayakovsky. Great, big, clouded cretin, that's what I am." "Perhaps somebody will pick it up," suggested Clara sympathetically. "Impossible, it's fate. There's no escaping fate. I'm doomed not to leave here. It was preordained." He sat down heavily. "I don't feel well, Clara. I was so short of breath on the street just now that I thought it was the end. God, I simply don't know what to do now, except perhaps kick the bucket." 13. Gannon, meanwhile, returned to his room and started to pack. From under the bed he pulled out 2 leather suitcases, one in a check cover and the other bare tan-colored with pale marks left by the labels, and spilled all the contents onto the floor. Then from the shaking, creaking darkness of the wardrobe he took out a black suit, a slender pile of underclothes, a pair of heavy brass-studded brown boots. From the bedside table he extracted a motley collection of bits and pieces thrown in there at various times, dirty handkerchiefs crumpled into balls, razor blades with rusty stains around their eyelets, old newspapers, picture postcards, some yellow beads like horses' teeth, a torn silk stock which had lost its twin. He took off his jacket, squatted down among all this sad, dusty rubbish, and began to sort out what to take and what to destroy. First he packed the suit and cleaned the underwear, then his automatic and a pair of old riding breeches badly worn around the crotch. And he pondered what to take next. He noticed a black wallet that had fallen under the chair when he had emptied his suitcase. He picked it up and was going to open it, smiling as he thought of what was in it, but then he told himself that he should hurry up with his packing, so he thrust his wallet into the hip pocket of his trousers and began quickly throwing his things at random in the open suitcases, crumpled dirty underclothes, Russian books which God alone knew how he had acquired, and all those trivial yet somehow precious things which become so familiar to our sight and touch, and whose only virtue is that they enable a person condemned to be always on the move to feel at home, however slightly, whenever he unpacks his fond, fragile, human rubbish from the 100th time. Having packed, Gannon locked both suitcases, stood them alongside each other, stuffed the paper basket with the corpses of old newspapers, glanced all around his empty room, and went off to settle up with the landlady. Sitting bolt upright in her armchair, Lydia Nikolaevna was reading when he entered. Her dachshund slithered off the bed and began thrashing about in a little fit of hysterical devotion at Gannon's feet. Lydia Nikolaevna saddened as she realized this time he really was about to leave. She liked the tall, relaxed figure of Gannon. She generally tended to grow very used to her lodgers, and there was something a little akin to death in their inevitable departures. Gannon paid her for the past week and kissed her hand light as a faded leaf. As he walked back down the passage, he remembered that today the dancers had invited him to a party, and he decided not to go away just yet. He could always take a room in a hotel, even after midnight if necessary, and tomorrow Mary arrives, he exclaimed mentally, glancing round the ceiling, floor, and walls with a blissful and frightened look. And tomorrow I'm going to take her away, he reflected with the same inward shudder, the same luxurious sigh of his whole being. With a quick movement, he took out the black wallet in which he kept the 5 letters he had received during his time in the Crimea. Now in a flash he remembered the whole Crimean winter, 1917 to 1918, the nor'easter blowing and the stinging dust along the Yalta seafront. a wave breaking over the parapet onto the sidewalk, the insolent and bewildered Bolshevik sailors, and the Germans in their helmets like steel mushrooms, and the gray type color of the chevrons. Day of expectation and anxious breathing space, a thin freckled little prostitute with bobbed hair and a Greek profile walking along the seafront, the nor'easter again scattering the sheet of music from the band of the park, and then, at last, his company was on the march. The billets of Tartar hamlets were all day long in the tiny barber's shops. The razor glittered just as it always had, and one's cheeks swelled with lather, while little boys in the dusty streets whipped their tops as they had done 1,000 years ago. And the wild night attack when you had no idea where the shooting was coming from and who was sleeping through the puddles of moonlight between the slanting black shadows cast by the houses. Gannon took the first letter out of the bundle, a single thick oblong leaf, with a drawing in the top left-hand corner that showed a young man in a blue tailcoat, holding behind his back a bouquet of pale flowers and kissing the hand of a lady as delicate as he, with ringlets down her cheeks, wearing a pink high-waisted dress. That first letter had been forwarded to him from St. Petersburg to Yalta. It had been written just a little over 2 years after that blissful autumn. Leofa, I've been in Poltava for a whole week now. Hellishly boring. I don't know if I shall ever see you again, but I do so want you to not forget me. The handwriting was small and round and looked exactly as if it were running along on tiptoe. There were strokes under the letter and above the letter for clarity. The final letter of each word trailed off in an impetuous flick to the right. Only in the letter at the end of the word did the bar bend touchingly downward and to the left, as though Mary retracted the word at the last moment. Her full stops were very large and decisive, but there were a few commas. Just think, I've been looking at snow for a week, white, cold snow. It's cold, nasty, and depressing, and suddenly, like a bird, the thought darts through one's mind that somewhere, far, far away, there are people living another completely different life. They are not stagnating as I am in the sticks on a small farm. No, it's really too awfully dull here. Write me something, Leova. Even the most absolute trifles. Yet I remembered getting this letter. Remembered walking up a steep stony path on that distant January evening, past Tartar picket fences, hung here and there with horses' skulls. Remembered how he sat beside a rivulet, pouring in thin streams over smooth white stones, and stared through the countless delicate and amazingly distinct bare branches of an apple tree at the mellow pink of the sky, where the new moon glistened like a translucent nail clipping, and beside it, by the lower horn, trembled a drop of brightness, the first star. He wrote to her the same night about that star, about the cypresses in the garden, about the donkey whose roaring bray came every morning from the Tartar yard behind the house. He wrote affectionately, dreamily, recalling the wet catkins on the slippery footbridge of the pavilion where they first met. In those days, letters took a long time on their way. The answer did not come until July. Thank you very much for your good, sweet southern letter. Why do you write that you still remember me, and that you'll not forget me? No? How lovely! Today it's so nice and fresh after a thunderstorm, as at Vokresink, remember? Wouldn't you like to wander round those familiar places again? I would terribly. How lovely it was to walk in the rain through the park in autumn. Why wasn't it sad then and bad in weather? I'm going to stop writing for a while and go for a walk. I never did manage to finish the letter yesterday. Isn't that awful of me? Forgive me, Lova, dear. I promise I won't do it again. Gannon dropped his head with the letter for a moment, sat lost in thought. How well he remembered those merry mannerisms of hers. That husky little laugh when she apologized, that transition from a melancholy sigh to a look of ardent vitality. For a long time I was worried, not knowing where you were and how you were, she wrote in the same letter. Now we mustn't break off the little thread which links us. There's so much I want to write and ask you, but my thoughts wander. I've seen and lived through a lot of unhappiness since those days. Write, for God's sake, write often and more. All the very best for now. I'd like to say goodbye more affectionately, but perhaps I've forgotten how to do after all this time, or perhaps there's something else holding me back. For days after getting the letter, he was full of a trembling happiness. He could not understand how he could have parted from Mary. He only remembered their first autumn together. All the rest, those torments and trips, seemed so pale and insignificant. Those languorous darkness, the conventional sheen of the sea at night, the velvety hush of the narrow cypress avenues, the gleam of the moonlight on the broad leaves of the magnolias, all this only oppressed him. Duty kept him in Yalta. The Civil War was under way. But there were moments when he decided to give up everything and go look for Mary among the farms of the Ukraine. There was something touching and wonderful about the way their letters managed to pass across the terrible Russia of that time, like a cabbage-white butterfly, flying over the trenches. His answer to her second letter was very delayed, and Mary simply did not understand what had happened, and she was convinced that their letters were concerned with the usual obstacles of those days somewhat did not exist. It must seem strange to you that I'm writing to you despite your silence, but I refuse to believe that you still do not want to reply to me. You haven't replied not because you don't want to, but simply because you couldn't, or because you hadn't had time or something. Tell me, Lyova, doesn't it seem funny to remember that you once said to me that loving me was your life, and even if you couldn't love me, you wouldn't be alive? Yes, how everything passes, how things change. Would you like to have what happened all over again? And I think I'm feeling rather too depressed today. But today it is spring, and mimosa for sale at all corners is offered today. And I'm bringing you some, like a dream. It is real. Nice little poem, but I can't remember the beginning or the end, and I forget who wrote it. Now I shall wait for your letter. I don't know how to say goodbye to you. Perhaps I've kissed you. Yes, I suppose I have. 2 or 3 weeks later came her 4th letter. I was glad to get your letter, Lyova. It's such a nice letter. Yes, one can never forget how much and how radiantly one loved. You write that you would give your whole future life for a moment from the past, but it would be better to meet and verify one's feelings. Lyova, if you do come, ring up the local telephone exchange and ask for number 34. They may answer you in German. There is a German military hospital there. Ask them to call for me. I was in town yesterday and had some fun. It was very gay with lots of music and lights, and very amusing man with a little yellow beard made a play for me and called me the queen of the ball. Today it is so boring. It's such a pity that the days go by so pointlessly and stupidly, and they are supposed to be the best, the happiest years of our life. It looks as if I shall soon turn into a hypocrite. I mean, a hypochondriac. No, that mustn't happen. Let me get rid of the shackles of love, and let me try to stop thinking. Replenish the glasses with wine. Let me keep drinking and drinking. Quite something, isn't it? Write to me as soon as you get my letter. Will you come here and see me? Impossible? Well, too bad. Perhaps you can, though. What nonsense I'm writing, to come all the way here just to see me. What conceit, don't you think? Just now I read a poem in an old magazine, My Little Pale Pearl by Kropotkin. I like it very much. Write and tell me absolutely everything. I kiss you. There's something else I've read by Potugin. The full moon shines over forest and stream. Look at the ripples, how richly they gleam. Dear Potugin, mused Gannon, how strange, goodness, how strange. If someone had told me when I should meet him, of all people. Smiling and shaking his head, he unfolded one last letter. He had received it the day before leaving the front line. It had been a cold January dawn on board ship, and he had felt queasy from drinking coffee made from acorns. Lyova, my darling, my joy, how I waited and longed for your letter. It was so hard and painful to write you such restrained letters. How can I have lived these 3 years without you? How I've managed to survive, and what was there to live for? I love you. If you come back, I'll plague you with kisses. Do remember. Write to them that my little boy Lyov, I kiss as much as I can. That an Austrian helmet from Lyov, to bring for his birthday I planned, but a separate note to my father. Goodness, where has it gone? All that distant, bright, endearing, like you. I feel that we shall meet again, but when? When? I love you. Come to me. Your letter was such a joy that I still can't regain my senses for happiness. Happiness, Gannon repeated softly, folding all 5 letters into an even hatch. That's it. Happiness. We are going to meet again in 12 hours' time. He stood motionless, preoccupied with secret, delicious thoughts. He had no doubt that Mary still loved him. Her 5 letters lay in his hand. Outside it was quite dark. The knobs on his suitcases gleamed. The desolate room smelled faintly of dust. He was still sitting in the same position when the voices were heard outside the door, and suddenly, without knocking, Alfierov strode into the room. "Oh, sorry," he said, without showing any particular embarrassment. "I somehow thought you'd already gone." His fingers playing with the folded letters, Gannon stared vacantly at Alfierov's little yellow beard. The landlady appeared in the doorway. "Lydia Nikolaevna," Alfierov went on, twitching his neck and crossing the room with a proprietorial air, "we must get the darn thing out of the way so that we can open the door into my room." He tried to move the wardrobe, grunted, and staggered back helplessly. "Let me do it," Gannon suggested cheerfully, thrusting the black wallet into his pocket as he stood up and walked over to the wardrobe and spat in his hands. 14. The black trains roared past, shaking the windows of the house with a movement like ghostly shoulders shaking off a load. Heaving mountains of smoke swept upward, blotting out the night sky. The roofs burned with a smooth metallic blaze in the moonlight, and a sonorous black shadow under the iron bridge awoke as a black train rumbled across it, sending a chain of light flickering down its length. The clattering roar and a mass of smoke seemed to pass right through the houses. It quivered down the chasm where the rail tracks lay like lines drawn by a moonlit fingernail, and the street where it was crossed by the flat bridge, waiting for the next regular thunder of railway carriages. The house was like a spectre you could put your hand through and wriggle your fingers. Standing at the window of the dancer's room, Gannon looked down to the street. The asphalt gleamed dully. Black, foreshortened people walked hither and thither, disappearing into shadows and re-emerging in the slanting light reflected from the shop windows. In an uncurtained window of the house opposite, sparkling glass and gilded flames could be seen in the bright amber gap. Then an elegant black shadow pulled down the blinds. Gannon turned round. Colin handed him a quivering glass full of vodka. The room was lit by a somewhat pale, unearthly light because the ingenious dancers had shrouded the lamp in a scrap of mauve silk. On the table in the middle of the room, bottles gave off the violet-colored gleam. Oil glistened in open sardine tins, where there were chocolates in silver wrappings, a mosaic of sausage slices, glazed meat patties. Sitting at the table were Potyugin, pale and morose, with beads of sweat on his large forehead, Alferov sporting a brand new shot silk tie, Clara in her eternal black dress, languid and flushed from drinking cheap orange liquor, Gornestovov, without jacket and wearing a soiled silk shirt with an open collar, was sitting on the edge of the bed, tuning a guitar which he had somehow obtained. Colin kept constantly on the move, pouring out vodka, liquors, pale Rhine wine, his fat hips wriggling comically while his trim torso, gripped by a tight blue jacket, remained almost motionless as he moved. "What, not drinking?" he pouted, asking the conventional reproachful question as he raised his melting glance to Gannon. "Yes, why not?" said Gannon, sitting down on the window ledge and taking the light, cold wine-glass from the dancer's trembling hand. Tossing it down, he glanced round to the people sitting at the table. All were silent, even Alferov, who was much too excited by the fact that in 8 or 9 hours' time his wife would arrive. "The guitar's in tune," said Gornostovov, as he adjusted a key and plucked the string. He struck a chord, then dampened the twang-twang sound with his palm. "Why aren't you singing, gentlemen, in Clara's honor? Come along now, like a fragrant flower." Grinning at Clara and raising his glass with mock gallantry, Alferov leaned backward in his chair, which he nearly fell over as if it was a revolving stool without a back, and made an effort to sing in a false-affected little tenor, but no one else joined in. Gornestovov gave a final pluck to the strings and stopped playing. Everyone felt awkward. "Some singers!" Potyugin grunted despondently and shook his head, propped on his hand. He felt bad. He thought of his lost passport was combined with a stifling shortness of breath. "I shouldn't drink, that's the trouble," he added glumly. "I told you so," murmured Clara. "You're like a baby, Anton Sergeyevich." "Why isn't anybody eating or drinking?" said Colin, waggling his head as he minced around the table. He began filling up empty glasses. Nobody said anything. The party obviously was a failure. Gannon, who then had been sitting on the window ledge and staring, with a faint smile of pensive irony, at the mauve glimmer of the table and the strangely lit faces, suddenly jumped down to the floor and gave a peal of clear laughter. "Fill him up, Colin," he said as he walked over to the table. "Some more for Alferov. Tomorrow our life changes. Tomorrow I shan't be here any longer. Come down a hatch. Stop looking at me like a wounded deer, Clara. Give her some more of that liquor. You too, Anton Sergeyevich. Cheer up. No good moving about your passport. You'll get another one, even better than the old one. Recite us some of your poetry. Oh yes, by the way, can I have that empty bottle?" Alferov said suddenly, and a lascivious gleam sparkled in his joyful, excited eyes. "By the way," Gannon repeated, coming up behind the old man and putting his hand on his fleshy shoulder, "I remember some of your verses, Anton Sergeyevich. Full moon, forest, and stream. Isn't that right, isn't it?" Potyugin turned and looked at him, then gave an unhurried smile. "Did you find it in an old calendar?" "Yes, they were very fond of printing my poetry on calendar leaves, on the underside, above the recipe for the day." Gentlemen, what is he trying to do?" shouted Colin, pointing at Alferov, who, having flung open the window, had suddenly raised the bottle and was aiming it in the dark blue light. "Let him," Gannon laughed. "Let him act up if he wants to." Alferov's beard gleamed, his Adam's apple swelled, and his sparse hair at his temple stirred the night breeze. Bringing back his arm in a wide sweep, he stood still for a while, then solemnly placed the bottle on the floor. The dancers burst into laughter. Alferov sat down beside Gornestovov, took the guitar from him, and began to try to play it. He was a man who got drunk very quickly. "Clara's so serious-looking," Potyugin said with difficulty. "Girls like her used to write me such moving letters. Now she doesn't want to look at me." "Don't drink any more, please," said Clara, thinking that she had never been so miserable in her life as now. Potyugin managed to force a smile and pulled at Gannon's sleeve. "Now here's the future savior of Russia. Tell us a story, Lvovshka. Where did you roam? Where did you fight? Must I?" asked Gannon with a good-natured grimace. "Yes, do. I feel so depressed, you know. When did you leave Russia?" "When? Hey, Colin, let's have some of that sticky stuff." "No, not for me, for Alferov. That's right. Mix it into his glass." 15. Lydia Nikolaevna was already in bed. She had nervously refused the dancer's invitation, was now sleeping in an old woman's light sleep, through which the heavy vibration of the trains passed with the sound of huge cupboards full of quivering crockery. Occasionally her sleep would be broken, and then she would vaguely hear the voices from room 6. Once she dreamed of Gannon. In her dreams she could not understand who he was or where he come from. Indeed, his personality was surrounded by mystery, and no wonder. He never told anybody about his life, his wanderings, and his adventures of recent years. Even he himself remembered his escape from Russia as though in a dream that was like a faintly sparkling sea mist. Perhaps Mary had written more letters at that time, early 1919, when he was fading in the northern Crimea, but he had not received them. If she had, Perekop tottered and fell. Wounded in the head, Gena had been evacuated to Simferopol, and a week later, sick and listless, cut off from his unit, he retreated to Feodosia. He had been caught up in the mad, nightmarish torrent of the civilian evacuation. In the fields and on the slopes of the height of Inkerman, where once the uniforms of Queen Victoria's soldiers had flashed scarlet among the smoke of the toy cannon, the lovely and wild Crimean spring was already blossoming, smoothly undulating. The milky white road flowed on. The open cover of the car rattled as the wheels bounced over bumps and holes, and the feeling of speed, the feeling of spring, of space and pale green of the hills, suddenly fused into a delicious joy which made it possible to forget that this light-hearted road was the way leading out of Russia. He reached Sevastopol, still full of joy, and left his suitcase at the white stone hotel kist, where the confusion was indescribable. Then, drunk with hazy sunshine and the dull pain in his head, he set off, past the pale Doric columns of the portico, down the broad granite flagstones of the steps of the harbor, and stared long at the melting blue glitter of the sea without the idea of exile once entering in his head. Then he climbed back up to the square where the grey statue of the Admiral Nakhimov stands with a long naval frock coat with spyglass, and wandering along the dusty white street as far as the fourth bastion, he visited the panorama. Beyond the circular balustrade, genuine old gun sandbags, intentionally strewn splinters and real circus-like in sand, merged into a soft, smoky blue, rather airless picture which surrounded the sightseer's platform and teased the eye with the elusiveness of its boundaries. This was how Sevastopol remained in his memory, vernal, dusty, and in the grip of a kind of lifeless, dreamly disquiet. At night on board a ship, he watched the empty white sleeves of searchlights filling in and sinking in across the sky, while the black water looked varnished in the moonlight, and farther away in the night haze, a brightly lit foreign cruiser rode at anchor, resting on the steamy gold pillars of his own reflection. He took passage on a shabby Greek ship. The deck was covered with rows of pitiless, swarthy refugees from Eupatoria, where the ship had called out that morning. Gannon had installed himself in the wardrobe, where the lamp ponderously swayed and the long table was piled with huge onion-shaped bundles. Then came several glorious sad days at sea, like two floating white wings with oncoming foam, embraced everything, embraced the bow and the steamer as though it cut through it. And the green shadows of the people leaning on the ship's rails flickered softly across the bright slopes of the waves. The rusty steering gear creaked. Two seagulls glided around the funnel, and their wheels caught in a ray of sunshine, flashed like diamonds. Nearby, a big-headed Greek baby began crying, and its mother lost her temper and started to spit at it in desperate effort to silence it. A stoker sometimes emerged on the deck, black all over, with eyes ringed with coal dust and a fake ruby on his index finger. It was such trivia, not a nostalgia for his abandoned homeland, that stuck again in his memory, as though only his eyes had been alive and his mind gone into hiding. On the second day, Istanbul loomed starkly in the orange-colored evening and slowly dissolved into night which overtook the ship. At dawn, Gannon climbed up into the bridge. The vague dark blue outline of the Scutari shore was gradually becoming visible. The moon's reflection narrowed and paled. In the east, the blue mauve of the sky modulated to a golden red, and Istanbul, shining faintly, began to float out into the mist. A silky band of ripples glittered along the shore. A black rowboat and a black fez sailed noiselessly past. Now the east was turning white, and the breeze sprung up, which brushed over Gannon's face in salty trickle. From the shore came the sound of a reveille being played. Two seagulls, black as crows, flapped over the ship. With a patter like a light rain of shoal of fish broke out the surface in this network of momentary rings. A ladder came out alongside, and the water beneath it, and its shadow extended and then retracted its tentacles, but only when Gannon stepped ashore and saw a blue-clad Turk on the wayside asleep with a mountain of oranges. Only when did he feel a clear, piercing sense of how far he was up in the worn mass within his own country and from Mary, from whom he loved forever. And this now unfolded in his memory, flashing disjointedly, and shrank again into a warm lump when Potugin, with a great effort, asked him, "How long ago did you leave Russia?" 5 years, he answered curtly, and then as he sat in a corner of the languorous violet light which poured over the cloth on the table in the center of the room and over the smiling faces of Colin and Gordon Stephanov, who were dancing silently and energetically in the middle of the room, Gannon thought, what happiness! Tomorrow! No, it's today! It's already past midnight! Mary cannot have changed since then. Her Tartar eyes still burn and smile just as they did. He would take her far away. He would work tirelessly for her. Tomorrow all his youth, his Russia, was coming back to him again. Arms akimbo, throwing back his head and shaking it, now gliding, now stamping his heels and waving his handkerchief, Colin was wheeling along Gordosavov, who was squatting on his haunches, was nimbly, rakishly kicking his legs out quicker and quicker until he was finally revolving on one bent leg. Totally drunk, Alvarov sat swaying with a benign expression. Clara kept glancing anxiously at Potkin's gray, sweating face. The old man sat in an awkward sideways position on the bed. "You aren't well, Anton Sergeyevich," he whispered. "You should go to bed. It's around 1:30. Oh, how simple it would be tomorrow. No, today. He would see her again, provided Alvarov got really tight. Only 6 hours more. Right now she should be asleep in her compartment. The telegraph poles flying by in the darkness, pine trees and hills rushing up to the train. What a noise these boys were making. Won't they ever stop dancing? Yes, amazingly simple. At times there was something like a genius in the workings of fate. All right, I shall go and lie down a bit," said Potyakin dully, with a heavy sigh and starting to leave. "Where is the grand fellow going? Stop, stay a bit longer," Alvarov muttered gaily. "Have another drink and shut up," Gannon said to Alvarov, then quickly joined Potyakin. "Lead on me, Anton Sergeyevich." The old man looked hazily at him and made a gesture as though swatting a fly, and suddenly, with a faint cry, he staggered and pitched forward. Gannon and Clara managed to catch him in time. While the dancers fussed around, scarcely moving his stickly tongue, Alvarov blabbered with drunk and callousness. Look, he's dying. "Stop running about and do something useful, Gornistovov," Gannon said calmly. "Hold his head. Colin. Support him here. No, that's my arm. Higher up. Stop gaping at me like that. Higher up, I say. Open the door, Clara." The three of them carried the old man to his room. Staggering, Alvarov made as if to follow them, then limply waved his hand and sat down at the table. With a shaking hand he poured himself out some vodka, then pulled a nickel-plated watch out of his waistcoat pocket and put it in front of him on the table. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He drew his finger around the Roman figures and stopped, his head turned aside, and sat watching the second head with one eye. In the passage, the dachshund began yelping in a high-pitched, excited voice. Alvarov grimaced. "Lousy little dog, ought to be run over." A little later he took an indelible pencil out of another pocket and smeared a mauve mark on the glass above the figure 8. "She's coming, he said to himself in time with the ticking. He glanced round the table, took a chocolate, and immediately spat it out. A brown blob smacked against the wall. 3, 4, 5, 7. Alvarov started counting again and winked at the dial with a bleary, ecstatic smile. 16. The town had grown quiet in the night. The hunched old man in the black cloak was already on the move, tapping his stick and bending over with a grunt whenever its sharp point turned up a butt-end. An occasional car drove by, and even more rarely a night droshky would jolt by with a click of hooves. A drunk in a bowler hat was waiting for a tram on the corner, although the trams had stopped running at least 2 hours ago. A few prostitutes were strolling up and down, yawning and talking in shady loafers with upturned coat collars. One of the girls accosted Colin and Gornistovov as they advanced almost at a run, but she turned away again at once after casting a professional glance at their pale, effeminate faces. The dancers had undertaken to fetch a Russian doctor they knew to see Potyakin, and indeed, after an hour and a half, they returned accompanied by a sleepy-looking gentleman with a stiff, clean-shaven features. He stayed for half an hour, now and again making a sucking noise, as though he had a hole in his tooth, and then left. It was now very quiet in the unlighted room. There reigned that special, heavy, dull silence which always comes when several people are sitting in silence around a sick person. The night was now waning. Gannon's profile, turned toward the bed, seemed carved out of a pale blue stone. At the foot of the bed, a vague armchair floating in the waves of the dawn, Clara sat looking fixedly in the same direction. Farther away, Gornistovov and Colin huddled side by side on a little divan, and their faces were like two pale blobs. The doctor was already going down the stairs behind the black figure of Frau Dorn, her bunch of keys chinking softly as she apologized for the lift being out of order. Reaching the bottom, she opened the heavy front door, and the doctor, raising his hat, departed into the bluish haze. The old woman carefully locked the door, wrapped herself tighter in her black knitted shawl, and went upstairs. The steps were lit by a cold yellow light. Her keys tinkling gently, she reached the landing. The light on the staircase went out. In the lobby she met Gannon, who had come out of Potyakin's room, carefully pulling the door behind him. "The doctor was promised to come back in the morning," whispered the old woman. "How is he now? Better?" Gannon shrugged. "I don't know. I think not, though. The way he is breathing, it is a frightening sound." Lydia Nikolaevna sighed and timidly entered the room. With an identical movement, Clara and the two other dancers turned their palely glistening eyes toward her and then turned back again to stare at the bed. A breeze rattled the frame of the half-open window. Gannon walked down the passage on tiptoe and went back to the room where the party had recently taken place. As he supposed, Alvarov was sitting at the table. His face seemed swollen and shone gray from the combination of the light and the dawn of the theatrically shaded lamp. He was nodding, occasionally belching. On the watch-glass in front of him gleamed a drop of vodka in which a mauve trace of indelible pencil was spreading. Only 4 hours to go. Gannon sat down beside that drunken, drowsy creature and stared long at him, knitting his thick brows and propping his temple on his clenched fist, which stretched his skin and caused his eye to slant. Alferov suddenly came to life and slowly turned to look at him. "Isn't it time you were going to bed, my dear Alexey Ivanovitch?" said Gannon distinctly. "No," Alferov pronounced with difficulty, and after some thought, as though solving a difficult problem, he repeated, "No." Gannon switched off the unnecessary light, took out a cigarette case, and lit a cigarette. Whether from the cold of the pale dawn or the whiff of tobacco, Alferov seemed to sober up a little. He rubbed his forehead with the palm of his hand, looked around and stretched out a fairly firm hand for the bottle. Halfway to it, his hand stopped and he shook his head. Then with a slack smile said to Gannon, "Mustn't have any more. Mary's coming." After a while, he shook Gannon's arm. "Hey, you, what's your name? Lebovich? Do you hear me, Mary?" Gannon exhaled the smoke and stared hard into Alferov's face. He took it in all at once, the wet, half-open mouth, the little dung-colored beard, the watery, blinking eyes. "Listen, Lebovich." Alferov swayed and grabbed him by the shoulder. "Right now I'm dead drunk, canned, tight as a drum. They made me drink, darn 'em. That's not it. I wanted to tell you about the girl. You need a good sleep, Alexey Ivanovitch. There was a girl, I tell you. No, I'm not talking about my wife. My wife's pure. But I've been so many years without my wife, so not long ago. No, it was long ago. Can't remember when. Girl took me up to her place. Foxy-looking little thing, such filth, yet delicious. And now Mary's coming. Do you realize what that means? Do you realize or not? I'm drunk. Can't remember how to say purple, perpendicular, and Mary'll be here soon. Why did it all have to happen like this, eh? I'm asking you. You darn Bolshevik. Can't you tell me why?" Gannon gently pushed away his hand. Head nodding, Alferov leaned forward over the table. His elbow slipped, rumpling the tablecloth and knocking over the glasses. The glasses, a saucer, and the watch slid to the floor. "Bed," said Gannon, and jerked him violently to his feet. Alferov did not resist, but he was unsteady, that Gannon could hardly make him walk in the right direction. Finding himself in his own room, he gave a broad, sleepy grin and collapsed slowly onto the bed. Suddenly horror crossed his face. "Alarm clock," he mumbled, sitting up. "Lev, over there, on the table. Alarm clock. Set it for 7:30. "All right," said Gannon, and began moving the hand. He set it for 10 o'clock, then changed his mind and set it for 11. When he looked at Alferov again, the man was already sound asleep, flat on his back with one arm oddly thrown out. This was how drunken tramps used to sleep in Russian villages. All day in the shimmering, sleepy heat, tall laden carts had swayed past, scattering the country road with bits of hay, and the tramp had lurched noisily along, pestering girl vacationists, beating his resonant chest, proclaiming himself the son of a general, and finally slapping his peaked cap to the ground. He had lain down across the road, and had stayed there until a peasant climbed down from his hay wagon. The peasant had dragged him to the verge and dried on. The tramp, turning his pale face aside, had lain like a corpse on the edge of the ditch, while the great green bulk, swaying and sweet-smelling, had glided past through the dappled shadows of the lime trees in bloom. Putting the alarm clock noiselessly down on the table, Gannon stood for a long time looking at the sleeping man. Then, jingling the money in his trouser pocket, he turned and quietly went out. In the dim little bathroom next to the kitchen, briquettes of coal were piled up under a piece of matting. The pane of the narrow window was broken, and there were yellow streaks on the walls. The metal shower head curved, whip-like, out of the wall above the black, peeling bathtub. Gannon stripped naked and for several minutes stretched his arms and legs, strong, white, blue-veined. His muscles cracked and rippled. His chest breathed deeply and evenly. He turned on the tap of the shower, and stood under the icy fan-shaped stream, which produced a delicious contraction in his stomach. Dressed again, tingly hot all over, trying not to make any noise, he dragged his suitcases out in the hallway and looked at his watch. It was 10 to 6. He threw his hat and coat on top of the suitcases and slipped into Potyukin's room. The dancers were asleep on the divan, leaning against each other. Clara and Lydia Nikolaevna were bending over the old man. His eyes were shut and his face, the color of dried clay, was occasionally distorted by an expression of pain. It was almost light. The trains were rumbling sleepily through the house. As Gannon approached the bedhead, Potyukin opened his eyes. For a moment, in the abyss into which he kept falling, his heart had found some shaky support. There was so much that he wanted to say, that he would never see Paris now, still less his homeland, that his whole life had been stupid and fruitless, and that he didn't know why he had lived or why he was dying. Rolling his head from one side and glancing perplexedly at Gannon, he muttered, "You see, without any passport." Something like faint mirth twisted his lips. He screwed up his eyes again, and once more the abyss sucked him down. A wedge of pain drove itself into his heart, and to breathe there seemed to be unspeakable, unattainable bliss. Gannon, gripping the edge of the bed with his strong white hand, looked in the old man's face, and once again he remembered these flickering, shadowy doppelgangers, the casual Russian film extras, sold for 10 marks apiece and still flitting, God knows where, across the white gleam of a screen. It occurred to him that Potygin nevertheless had bequeathed something, even if nothing more than 2 pallid verses, which had blossomed into such warm, undying life for him. Gannon, in the same way as a cheap perfume of street signs in a familiar street became dear to us. For a moment he saw life in all the thrilling beauty of its despair and happiness, and everything became exalted and deeply mysterious. His own past, Potygin's face bathed in pale light, the blurred reflection of the window frame on the blue wall, and the 2 women in the dark dresses standing motionless beside him. Clara noticed with amazement that Gannon was still smiling, and she could not understand it. Smiling, he touched Potygin's hand, which barely twitched as it lay on the sheet, straightened up and turned to Frau Dorn and Clara. "I'm leaving now," he whispered. "I don't suppose we shall meet again. Give my regards to the dancers." "I'll see you out," said Clara as quietly, and added, "The dancers are asleep on the divan." And Gannon went out of the room. In the lobby he picked up his suitcases and threw his mackintosh over his shoulder, and Clara opened the door for him. "Thank you very much," he said, sidling out into the landing. "Good luck." For a moment he stopped. Already the day before he had momentarily thought it would be a good idea to explain to Clara that he never had any intention of stealing money but had been looking at old photographs. Yet now he could not remember what he had meant to say. So with a bow he set off unhurriedly down the staircase. Clara, holding the door handle, watched him go. He carried his suitcases like buckets, and his heavy footfalls made a noise on the stairs like a slow heartbeat. Long after he had disappeared round the turn of the banisters, she stood and listened to that steady, diminishing tap. Finally she shut the door, stood for a moment in the hallway. She repeated aloud, "The dancers are asleep on the divan," and suddenly burst into a soundless but violent sobs, running her index finger up and down the wall. 17. The thick, heavy hands on the huge white clock face that projected sideways from a watchmaker's sign showed 24 minutes to 7. In the faint blue of the sky that had still not warmed up after the night, only one small cloud had begun to turn pink, and there was an unearthly grace about its long, thin outline. The footsteps of those unfortunates who were up at about this hour rang out with especial clarity in the deserted air, and in the distance a fleshy pink light quivered on the tram tracks. A small cart loaded with enormous bunches of violets half covered with a coarse-striped cloth moved slowly along close to the curb, the flower seller helping a large red-haired dog to pull it. Its tongue hanging out, the dog was straining forward, exerting every one of its sinewy muscles devoted to man. From the black branches of some trees, just beginning to sprout green, a flock of sparrows fluttered away with an airy rustle and settled on the narrow ledge of a high brick wall. The shops were still asleep behind their iron grills, the houses as yet sunlit only from above, but it would have been impossible to imagine that this was sunset and not early morning, because the shadows lay the wrong way. Unexpected combinations met the eye accustomed to evening shadows, but unfamiliar with auroral ones. Everything seemed askew, attenuated, metamorphosed, as in a mirror. And just the sun rose higher, and the shadows dispersed in their usual places, so that the sober light in the world of memories in which Gannon had dwelt became what it was in reality, the distant past. He looked round and saw at the end of the street the sunlit corner of the house where he had been reliving his past, and to which he would never return again. There was something beautifully mysterious about the departure from his life of a whole house. As the sun rose higher and higher, and the city grew lighter in step with it, the street came to life and lost its strange shadowy charm. Gannon walked down the middle of the sidewalk, gently swinging his solidly packed bags, and thought how long it was since he felt so fit, strong, and ready to tackle anything, and the fact that he kept noticing everything with a fresh, loving eye, the carts driving to the market, the slender, half-unfolded leaves, and the many-colored posters which a man in an apron was sticking around a kiosk. This fact meant a secret turning point for him, an awakening. He stopped in the little public garden near the station and sat on the same bench where such a short while ago he had remembered Typhus, the country house, the presentiment of Mary. In an hour's time she would be coming. Her husband was sleeping the sleep of the dead, and he, Gannon, was about to meet her. For some reason he suddenly remembered how he had gone to say goodbye to Ludmilla, how he had walked out of her room. Behind the public garden a house was being built. He could see the yellow wooden framework of the beams, the skeleton of the roof, which in parts was already tiled. Despite the early hour, work was already in progress. The figures of the workmen on the frames showed blue against the morning sky. One was walking along the ridge piece, light and free as though he were about to fly away. The wooden frame shone like gold in the sun, while on On it, two workmen were passing tiles to a third man. They lay on their backs, one above the other in a straight line as if on a staircase. The lower man passed the red slab like a large book over his head. The man in the middle took the tile and with the same movement, leaning right back and stretching out his arms, passed it on up to the workman above. This lazy, regular process had a curiously calming effect. The yellow sheen of fresh timber was more alive than the most lifelike dream of the past. As Gannon looked up at the skeletal roof and the ethereal sky, he realized with merciless clarity that his affair with Mary was ended forever. It had lasted no more than 4 days, 4 days which were perhaps the happiest days of his life, but now he had exhausted his memories, was sated by them, and the image of Mary, together with that of the old dying poet, now remained in the house of ghosts, which itself was already a memory. Other than that image, no Mary existed, nor could exist. He waited for the moment when the express from the north slowly rolled across the iron bridge. It passed on and disappeared behind the facade of the station. Then he picked up his suitcases, hailed a taxi, and told the driver to go to a different station at the other end of the city. He chose a train leaving for the southwestern Germany in half an hour, spent a quarter of his whole fortune on the ticket, and thought with pleasurable excitement how he would cross the frontier without a single visa. And beyond it was France, Provence, and then the sea. As his train moved off, he fell into a doze, his face buried in the folds of his mackintosh, hanging from a hook above the wooden seat. About the author. Vladimir Nabokov was born in St. Petersburg on April 23, 1899. His family fled to Germany in 1919 during the Bolshevik Revolution. Nabokov studied French and Russian literature at Trinity College, Cambridge, from 1919 to 1923, then lived in Berlin 1923 to 1937 and Paris 1937 to 1940, where he began writing, mainly in Russian, under the pseudonym Sirin. In 1940 he removed to the United States, where he pursued a brilliant literary career as a poet, novelist, critic, and translator while teaching literature at Wellesley College, Stanford, Cornell, and Harvard. The monumental success of his novel, Lolita, in 1955, enabled him to give up teaching and devote himself fully to his writing. In 1961, he moved to Montreux, Switzerland, where he died in 1977. Recognized as one of this century's master prose stylists in both Russian and English, he translated a number of his original English works, including Lolita, into Russian, and collaborated on English translations of his original Russian works. Thank you for listening. That was the second time I've read the book aloud. For my channel, although this time for the new channel. I plan to read the rest of Nabokov's books as rereads. The books that many of the books that I already read, like a few years ago on my old channel, I lost all of those recordings. A lot of them were live streams, and so I'm working to reread some of them. I don't know if I'm going to read every single one of them, but I'm going to try to at least read some of them. Thank you for listening.